Hear me okay?
Yes, we can. I don't know about
Perfect.
everyone else, but
Try to hide the floating meeting controls. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction and providing some of the context for the work that's happening here in New York. Today, I'm going to be talking about carbon budgets and particularly focusing on inland waters, where a lot of carbon dioxide and methane can be produced and emitted to the atmosphere. But we also know that a lot of carbon can be stored in the sediments of lakes, ponds, and wetlands. I'm an assistant professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I arrived in 2020, so I've been here for 2.5 years. And during my first year here, I applied for some funding from New York State Water Resources Institute, specifically to start looking at carbon burial and sequestration in the sediments, as a lot of my prior work had focused on emissions of methane and carbon dioxide. That work is still ongoing, but it also allowed me to get pilot data, preliminary information, which led to a current grant with the state of New York, which I'll talk about as well. And Brian will jump in and we can also jumpstart discussion after my talk. I hope to talk for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And Brian has been helpful in thinking about the context for this work. And so a lot of my work focuses on ponds, and I think of ponds as limnology underdogs. So limnology is the study of our inland freshwaters, and a lot of work has been done on lakes, and less work has been done on the small lakes or ponds. And so what you're seeing here is just a figure showing the number of times that published studies have lake in the title of the manuscript in red versus pond in the title in blue. Now, this makes more context when you see the global distribution of our water bodies. So we're mostly publishing on lakes, yet if we look at this figure on the right, we see that across all water body sizes, the number of lentic water bodies, so still water bodies on the y-axis, the vast majority of our water bodies are really small. Over 75% of all mapped water bodies on the planet are less than a hectare in size. And we don't have great estimates on the water bodies even smaller than that. But there are estimates based off of mathematical models that there could be up to 3 billion very small water bodies, so very small ponds on the landscape. Now, this is a logarithmic relationship, a log-log scale. So if we take away that log scale on the y-axis, you can see that this exponential relationship, right? The vast majority of our systems on the planet are small and it would be considered a pond, yet they're very understudied. And we can, in the past, people have said, well, ponds are just little lakes. So we can study our lakes and we kind of know what ponds are doing because we can just predict what they're doing based off of what we know about our larger lakes. And there's more and more evidence that that's just not the case. Ponds are ecological hotspots in many different ways. First of all, we know that ponds are more biodiverse than lakes. So if you're just looking at an aerial basis, it's actually more important to conserve several small ponds than a single larger lake of the same surface area, because of the diversity that ponds have, and amphibians and macroinvertebrates are some of the gems of that diversity. There are also biogeochemical hotspots, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. Ponds intercept and retain nutrients and sediments. This is a recent study that found ponds existing on the landscape were really important for downstream water quality, because they store phosphorus and nitrogen and keep them from going into our downstreams and coastal systems, and also trap sediments. My previous research that I'll also talk about today shows that ponds can emit high amounts of methane. They turn that carbon into methane that can get released to the atmosphere. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And that can be a problem when we start thinking about carbon budgeting and accounting. And there's also some recent research suggesting that ponds can store high quantities of carbon in their sediments. Although these numbers are all really limited in terms of number of studies that have looked at small water bodies and their carbon storage as well as their greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really become an important research priority. So going back to this idea that pond ecosystems are often viewed as small versions of lakes, we now know that pond ecosystems may function very differently than lakes. And a lot of that comes from their morphometry, the fact that they're shallow, they're small, they have a big edge effect, right? So if you think about the total amount of surface area relative to edge, you have a lot of edge in these systems, and the edge is where our terrestrial inputs, things like leaf litter and sediments, can come into the system. The fact that they're shallow means that the bottom and the top of the water column are more connected. We call that benthic, being the bottom waters, and pelagic, or the surface waters, coupling. So all that respiration and breakdown of organic matter that's happening at the bottom can influence our surface waters, which exchange with the atmosphere. And we also see that light can penetrate a greater percentage of the water column in these shallow systems. It just doesn't, the light doesn't have to get as far to get down to the bottom. And that can affect things like the breakdown of organic matter, as well as the production of organic matter through primary production. And so this is sort of giving you one of the take-home messages of the talk up front. And this is a study that we published this summer looking at a suite of ecosystem functions, things like methane flux, primary production, phosphorus, chlorophyll values, temperature, and looking at those relationships with surface area, which is on the x-axis here, right? This is surface area from small ponds up to very large lakes. And what we wanted to look at here is just this relationship. Do we see a trend across size? And is that trend linear or not? Because if it is a linear trend, then ponds are just little lakes, and we can predict what we know about big lakes by just scaling down linearly. But what you can see here is that for 8 of these 9 metrics, we have a significant relationship, and it is not a linear relationship, but rather we're seeing that ponds have more intense biogeochemical activities than lakes. And we also were looking to see at what point this threshold changes. You're looking at surface area. The average threshold change for surface area is about 3.7 hectares. And we did the same thing with depth, and we found a threshold change around 5 meters. So we're using these functions to actually get at a functional definition of what a pond is versus a lake or a shallow lake or a wetland. And so when I talk about ponds today, I'm mostly talking about water bodies that are less than 5 hectares in size and less than 5 meters in depth, although my lab also dabbles in shallow lakes, wetlands, all of these quadrants. So today I want to talk to you primarily about greenhouse gases and carbon, so both the emissions to the atmosphere and burial in the sediments. And I'll conclude by talking a little bit about the new grants that we have on these topics. Okay, so to begin with the greenhouse gases, I'm going to give you a bit of a primer on carbon cycling in lakes and ponds, as I don't expect, especially the students in the room, to be familiar with it. So we see across a water column that there can be a lot of decomposition at the bottom of a lake or a pond or a wetland. We have terrestrial leaves that come in, or plants that are growing, like these emergent plants on the sides, right? When these die and start to decompose, that's when a lot of cool biogeochemical activity can happen in these water bodies. And we work across an oxygen gradient, because where all that decomposition is taking place, that consumes a lot of oxygen. And we can get anoxic, which means no oxygen, or hypoxic, which means low oxygen environments down here. Versus at the top of the water column, we constantly have gas exchange between the water and the atmosphere, and that can increase oxygen values close to the air-water interface. So this decomposition, if we just have our normal heterotrophic bacteria consuming oxygen, producing CO2 like us as we breathe, doing that decomposition. Now that carbon dioxide can get taken up by our primary producers, like our phytoplankton, and it can also diffuse out of the pond into the air. And that diffusion is based off of a concentration gradient. If there's more carbon dioxide in the water than the air, it diffuses out. If there's more in the air and less in the water, it diffuses in. I also mentioned that we have this oxygen gradient. When those heterotrophic microbes have used up all the oxygen in an area, it causes other bacteria, other microbes to become active. And in particular, we can see that methanogens, they can use the organic matter, break it down and produce methane. That's sort of at the, if you're have a biogeochemistry background, that's the bottom of the redox ladder. It's kind of the last thing that can provide some energy to these organisms. And so methane is produced, and similar things can happen. Methane can diffuse out of the water into the atmosphere. Methane can also be converted to CO2 by methane oxidizing bacteria. And so we have these different pathways. We also have methane that's produced in these anoxic sediments that can just bubble out of a water body. And so you might have experienced this before. If you're standing on a dock and you bounce on the dock, you might see bubbles that come up out of the sediment. That can largely be methane. We do run analyses on those bubbles to find out how much methane is in there. It typically, I mean, it can range between 30 to 80 or 90% of a bubble might be methane. And we can also see emissions of methane coming out of plants. Plants act like straws, where they can siphon methane from the pore water and sediments out to the atmosphere. So with all of these different pathways in which carbon dioxide and methane can be produced and emitted, we expect that ponds are going to have very high rates of emissions for reasons why I talked about earlier, right? This high edge effect means they get a lot of terrestrial inputs. So they get a lot of leaf litter that is broken down. There's also low water volume, and these systems are shallow. So the processes of decomposition at the bottom of a pond can reach the top of the pond more easily than it can in, say, Cayuga Lake or another deep lake, right? And because they're shallow, they're what we call polymictic, meaning that they're mixing several times a year. In New York, our lakes are what we call, most of them are what we call dimictic, meaning that they mix in the fall and they mix in the spring. But in the summer, they're really strongly stratified with a warm top layer and a cold bottom layer that don't intermix. But ponds, because they're shallow, you can have a hurricane or a big wind event that can mix the whole system. So that gives more opportunities for those gases that are produced at the bottom of the system to be emitted to the atmosphere. And during my dissertation, we started to look into the role of ponds in the global carbon cycle, and it really wasn't known. They had previously been excluded from all the greenhouse gas budgets and assumed that they just weren't very important, in part because limnologists, those freshwater ecologists, don't generally study the small water bodies. But also, individually they look so small, we didn't think they had a big role in the carbon budget at a global scale. So the aim of this study was to compile data from hundreds of water bodies all over the planet, ranging from kind of glorified puddles up to very large lakes, and to look to see how important ponds were at a global scale. And to just jump right to the results, we found that across all size classes of lakes and ponds, there was about 0.58 petagrams of carbon per year being emitted. 98% of that was coming from carbon dioxide. We know that methane has a much greater greenhouse gas warming potential. So if we think about what's called carbon dioxide equivalences, we turn other greenhouse gases into carbon dioxide equivalences, 28% of the warming potential is actually coming from methane. And then importantly, we had previously assumed these smaller water bodies that are highlighted here were not important for the global carbon budget. They weren't included in the global carbon budget. But you can see that for carbon dioxide, their emissions are comparable to the other size classes. And for methane, they are much higher, also very variable, right? Look at those error bars. We have a lot of uncertainty, but this is suggesting that ponds might play a big role. And we found that these smallest water bodies, the small ponds that are in the smallest size class, made up about 9% of lake surface area, but accounted for 15% of carbon dioxide emissions and 41% of the diffusive methane emissions coming out of water bodies at a global scale. So this suggests that they're actually pretty important and we can't just ignore them, even though, we're not sure about how many there are globally. That was published in 2016, and since then there have been many studies that found similar results, that these small water bodies, whether they're urban ponds that are human created, farm ponds, permafrost thaw ponds, right? All of these have really high emissions of methane and carbon dioxide. And so I was invited to be part of a global methane synthesis team looking at methane emissions from all water bodies on the planet, from headwater streams to the open ocean and everywhere in between. And what we found was that methane from aquatic systems accounts for half of global methane emissions. And that includes things like agriculture and waste or biomass burning, right? So all of these different types of fossil fuels, right? All of these different types of methane emissions, aquatic water bodies make up about half of that, with wetlands and lakes, including ponds, being the big drivers. So if we look within our lentic waters, so all of our lakes, reservoirs, ponds, we found similar numbers to what my study had found. And we used a pretty different data set, and we included bubbles that were coming out as well as diffusive fluxes. 37% of the flux of methane is coming from those smallest water bodies. And if we bump up a size class to include any water bodies less than 0.01 square kilometers, which is a hectare, 60% of the methane flux is coming from those smaller water bodies. So this is actually a pretty important question. And we also wanted to understand what causes these small water bodies to be such big emitters. So we are looking for drivers of methane flux, which might help us better predict at a global scale what emissions look like. If we know, is it a surface area thing? Is it a productivity thing? And what we found was that we could predict methane flux based off of surface area and dissolved organic carbon. And if we look at the bubbles, the ebullitive flux, we can predict it by chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A is a proxy of algal biomass. So we're seeing that both how productive the system is, as well as how big the system is influencing our methane flux. So this would suggest that if you have a very productive small pond, maybe a farm pond, you might see the highest methane emissions. There's a lot of uncertainty still. A lot of studies aren't measuring those bubbles, yet bubbles we found can make up anywhere from kind of none of the methane emissions to all of the methane emissions. We also found that most of the studies happened in the middle of our size classes, in medium-sized lakes. So we are calling for more studies on ponds and more studies on our largest lakes, and also to look at things like temporal coverage. Freshwater ecologists love to sample our systems in the middle of the summer. That might be when methane emissions are highest. So we're trying to get better temporal coverage, looking at spring and fall dynamics as well as summer dynamics. And we are, I think, at a point where we're going to be moving to more mechanistic models, not just saying, okay, what size is it and scaling those sizes up to the globe, but maybe more mechanistically thinking about productivity or dissolved organic carbon to model emissions. And thankfully, the global carbon budgets are picking up on this. And in the most recent report in 2021, this is a direct copy paste. Inland waters, lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, estuaries, emissions are proportionally the largest source of uncertainty in the methane budget. And they go on to explain why. But a decade ago, these systems weren't even included in some of these budgets. In the early 2000s, we didn't think that inland waters really even transformed carbon in terms of global dynamics. So we've come a long way in 2 decades. So I want to now fast forward to work that we've been doing here at Cornell, and this is work that was funded by the Water Resources Institute, looking at greenhouse gas emissions at Cornell's ponds. And so here you can see Cornell's experimental pond facility. This is just north of the Ithaca Airport, if you didn't know it existed. To give you a sense of scale, this is a very large barn. We can fit tractors in there. We have lab space in there. So the ponds are large and really exciting because they're all identical in size and shape, and we can manipulate them in a variety of ways. So we were looking at seasonal emissions at the ponds, again, to try to get at what's happening across a whole year. And we see that the ponds, our carbon dioxide sinks in the summer. They're very productive systems in the summer. There's a lot of submerged plants that grow, and they take up a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere, turn that into biomass. But then as we get into the fall, into September, October, we see a switch from being a sink of carbon dioxide to being a source of carbon dioxide. And what I want to highlight here is there's 4 black lines and then a big green line. The big green line is the average of the 4 ponds that we studied, and each of the black lines in the background is a pond. And the ponds were following very similar patterns to each other, which was exciting. And then we look at the diffusive fluxes of methane, and we see that methane is kind of always coming out of these ponds with a peak in midsummer in July. But we see a lot of variability. We see, big emissions, low emissions, kind of all summer long. And we're wondering if that relates to water column mixing and turnover. And, as the water column turns over, it can release that methane. As it stratifies, that methane can build again. And we have a new NSF funded grant to examine that specific question. And lastly, we're also thinking about those bubbles. And we had bubble traps out on these ponds continuously all season. And we found that we had a peak in the bubbles in late June, which gradually tapered off until the fall when the ponds basically weren't bubbling. So to summarize these greenhouse gas emissions, and then we'll quickly talk about burial, we see that the smallest water bodies emit the most carbon dioxide and methane. We see that the bubbles relate a lot to productivity, to how productive the ecosystem is. And we also see that in terms of methane, the water bodies that are less than a hectare in size account for 60% of lentic water body emissions, despite a lot of uncertainty that remains. So I'm going to move on to talking about carbon burial, because a lot of work has been now done on emissions, but that would not tell the whole story if ponds are also sequestering tremendous amounts of carbon in their sediments. So ponds are these big greenhouse gas emitters, but they also store carbon. How much carbon do they store? We can test this by taking sediment cores out of our water bodies. So this is a sediment core taken out of the experimental ponds. This is my postdoc, Nick Ray, who is holding a sediment core from a natural pond that we cored. This is, several hundred years of sediment that is accumulated in this core right here. And here is an undergraduate, Chelsea, processing those cores with us. And one thing that we did, and again, this is funded from the Water Resources Institute, was we collected sediment cores from our experimental ponds. And we also mapped sediment thickness. So what you're looking at here are the 22 ponds that we looked at. These are interpolated maps of sediment thickness. And then we took samples of those sediments and we took them back to the lab where Perry has been processing a lot of mud over the past couple of years and looking at how much carbon is in the mud. What we found was that these ponds are burying about 85 grams of carbon per square meter per year. To put that into the context, that's very similar to wetlands, and wetlands are often heralded as these big important stores of carbon globally, and about 5 times greater than what we see in many lakes in this region. So ponds are storing much more carbon than lakes on the same kind of order of magnitude as wetlands. Now we are working on a meta-analysis that's looking at all sorts of other aquatic ecosystems and trying to understand what causes carbon burial rate to differ across coastal systems versus freshwater wetlands versus lakes and reservoirs. And then here are a couple of studies, including ours right here at the bottom, looking at carbon burial rates, showing that again ponds have extremely high rates of carbon burial, much higher than natural lakes. Similar in some cases to reservoirs. And reservoirs, dammed up water bodies are known to store a lot of carbon because there's a literal dam that blocks that carbon from moving downstream. So it's pretty exciting to think that these systems, while they can emit a lot of methane, can also store a lot of carbon. We're also looking at 2 natural ponds in the area. Mud Pond is a Cornell owned pond about half an hour outside of Ithaca, and Texas Hollow is in Texas Hollow State Forest. And they're very similar in size, but Texas Hollow is 1 meter deeper than Mud Pond. And we're seeing differences in their carbon burial. If we look just at how much organic matter is in the sediment, we see that Mud Pond has far less organic matter in the sediment than Texas Hollow. Texas Hollow, the mud there is almost on the magnitude of what you think about with peat, just so much organic carbon in Texas Hollow sediments, suggesting that it's probably very anoxic and can't break down very quickly. And Mud Pond has more oxygen likely at the sediment water interface and can break down that organic matter quickly. Yet carbon burial rates were really similar up until about the year 2000. So we took those sediments, we looked at how much carbon was in them, and through that core, we sent the cores away to get dated, and we can now look to see what carbon burial rates are through time. And in about the year 2000, since then, Mud Pond carbon burial rates have been increasing dramatically, and we're looking into why that might be. We also have been measuring greenhouse gases in these 2 ponds, so we'll be able to compare both the burial rates and the emission rates. So we're seeing really high carbon burial rates in ponds, much greater than we would expect based off of what we see in lakes. And so ponds have the potential to be carbon sinks on a mass balance basis. But in terms of greenhouse gas warming potential, methane sort of blows the budget. So the big question, especially in artificial water bodies like farm ponds or residential ponds, is can we manage them to actually reduce methane emissions? And so that's a topic for a new grant that is funded by New York State through the CLPCA, through the Office of Climate Change at the New York State DEC, looking at pond emissions and carbon burial. So I just want to briefly highlight that grant. We're looking at natural wetlands and ponds at a statewide level. We're looking at human-made farm ponds and residential ponds. So this is a farm pond. This is an old farm pond now on a residential property where we're taking sediment cores in the winter. It's actually much easier to do on ice. If only we were getting some ice right now. We're a little disappointed with winter in Ithaca. We want to go take more sediment cores. To understand if we can figure out the levers for methane emissions, and if we can reduce methane emissions from these artificial water bodies, that would be huge in terms of their carbon benefits. And I mentioned this as well, we're looking at things like the water column turnover, the mixing regime of a water body, to better understand emissions of carbon dioxide and methane. And that is work that will be launching up this summer at the experimental ponds. So that's what I've got. Ponds are understudied, they're globally abundant, they're biogeochemical hotspots, and they're huge emitters of greenhouse gases. But they also have the potential for net carbon storage if we can reduce those methane emissions. And I think there's tremendous potential for that in terms of the human-built ponds, if we can build them in a different way to reduce their methane emissions, or if we can manage them, say, with aerators. That's a question we have right now. With that, this could not have happened without the New York State Water Resources Institute. We now have funding again from NSF and New York State DEC. There's a lot of collaborators that have gone into all of the projects I mentioned today, including my phenomenal team here at Cornell. And this is a photo of our lab group here. With that, I'm sure we can have lots of fun conversations about carbon and inland waters and New York State. So thanks for listening.
Yes. Thank you, Meredith. Rather than me doing any further presenting, does anybody have any questions? Okay, before we get into this open questions, I wanted to say something about, again, sort of like from a student perspective, right? Like, probably I need to develop a slide on this, right? But like, Meredith is an expert. Many people on the call are essentially represent managers of the resource. And another audience that we might have is like the general public, and they're all really important. So like, clearly this is important to Meredith because, you know, she loves it and that's her career. For managers, again, they're trying to meet the plans at the state level. We're trying to meet greenhouse gas reduction plans, et cetera. So they care about this work, especially if it shows that something can be done about it. But a lot of times it's not even possible to pass that legislation or get those plans implemented unless the public understands it enough to care about it and think that it's a decent idea, because it takes money, right? So you need some public buy-in as well. And I would say, like, as a student, you're kind of in the middle of all of those things. I mean, even if you decide this is not the topic that you care about, you are a member of the public, and someday you're going to have as much say as anyone else in terms of like, what do we do with our tax money, or what kind of policies should New York have? Or maybe you want to be a manager of the resource and you need to know just enough about a subject in order to figure out whether it can be useful for what you need to go do. Or you love it and you want to become an expert, right? So like those are all really, those are all paths that you still have. And so at this stage, though, we're not expecting any one student especially, or even any of us as managers or stakeholders to fully understand everything that Meredith just presented, right? Like there's a lot in there. And unless you are already a limnologist, which you're not, you don't understand some of that stuff. So it's okay. But hopefully you got like some impression over its relative importance, whether you're interested in it. And in particular right now, like, is there something you didn't understand that you'd really like to? And I would say now is like, yes, ask the question now, because why not, right? Like if you don't understand something, probably most of the folks on the call also don't understand it. So anyway, that's it, like questions, and then I'll try and provide a little more in terms of some, you know, management presentation, if there's time.
I can see a couple, I think 3 questions in the chat. I'm happy to read them out, but if people just want to unmute themselves and ask, that is also great. I'll give you all maybe 10 seconds, and if I don't see anyone unmuting, I will start reading the questions out.
So maybe since I posted my question first, so I'll take the opportunity. Meredith, it's a great talk, and I really enjoyed your talk, and you did a great campaign to push the pond on the map.
So can you please say who you are?
Oh, I'm Ichiro, I'm a professor at Cornell.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm a land carbon cycle person, but I'm interested in aquatic system as well. Well, also I'm new to Cornell, so I just been here for 6 months. So towards the end of your talk, you mentioned about how to reduce, potentially we can reduce methane emission from pond or the aquatic system. And can you elaborate your points? Thank you.
Thanks, Ichi. Yes, that's like the $1 million question. And that's where we want to go with it. So we're starting to compile evidence, right? By looking across lakes and ponds and looking at drivers of emissions, we see that the small water bodies emit more. We see that if you increase depth, right? And if you have a much deeper system, they emit less. If you have a more productive system, they emit more. And so we're starting to look at the drivers and think about, okay, well, the state of New York, for instance, is subsidizing the creation of more farm ponds. It's a climate resiliency strategy. As we get more and more droughts, farmers need water. And if they have ponds on their property, they can draw from that water to irrigate or to water their cows, for instance. And so I talked to farmers in the area, and they've been building 5, 6 ponds on their property in the last decade. Well, the state of New York does not want to be subsidizing the creation of farm ponds for a climate strategy while creating a different climate challenge, right? And so the state wants to know, how do we build ponds that emit less methane and store more carbon in their sediments? And so that's the big question that my lab wants to address. And so a couple of quick things on that. One is we're surveying about 30 farm and residential ponds this summer. So undergraduates, if you're looking for summer research, we're hiring. But we've picked out ponds that vary in their size. So smaller ponds versus larger ponds, deeper ponds versus shallower ponds. ponds that have buffers around them versus ponds where the ag goes right up to the edge or the lawn goes right up to the edge. So we're hoping that we can start to get an answer there. We also know that if you have a pond that is really low in oxygen, maybe it's so productive, there's just so much decomposition taking place, you get more methane. So we're experimenting with two things at the pond facility that Cornell has this summer. One is underwater circulators, where we're going to be mixing the whole water column of the pond so that we don't get these stagnant layers where we have a lot of buildup of gases. That can increase oxygen that goes to the bottom of the pond too. And so our pilot from this past fall found that the pond where we mixed it had much lower methane emissions. We also have some funding from the Atkinson Center for this summer to add on a treatment that's using an actual aerator. So it's actually going to bubble oxygen right into the pond, and it's solar powered. So if we can say that solar powered aerators cut methane emissions by 70%, well, then we could go out to our worst offending farm and residential ponds that we're sampling this summer. We can ask landowners, hey, if we can get the money, can we put a solar powered aerator on your farm pond, and then measure again in 2024 and see if that still holds, if we're reducing methane emissions. Because if it's solar powered, right, that's a big win for climate. Not if we're plugging it in and powering it on fossil fuels, but those are some of the things that I think are going to show how we could potentially reduce methane emissions in ponds.
Thank you. Wonderful ideas.
I see IT's question next. IT, do you wish to unmute, or I'm happy to read yours out? Okay, I think I'll just read it out. Do you see, so the question says, do you see a near future where social enterprises will connect with private property owners or land trusts to rent out ponds to large corporations or cities as an attempt to mitigate their carbon emissions in a similar way some forests are used? Or is such a ploy not feasible?
I love the idea. I love the question. It hasn't been something that I've thought a lot about, in large part because a lot of the work has shown that ponds are big methane emitters. So if anything, the question I usually get is, should we just fill in all our ponds? And my response is usually no, like they're extremely important for biodiversity. They're intercepting nutrients and carbon, keeping it out of our streams and from entering into our rivers that feed the ocean, right, and lead to dead zones. So really important services they're providing. If we could figure out a way to get them to be carbon beneficial, which I think is a possibility if we reduce those methane emissions, then maybe. I don't see where we'd be like renting them out potentially. However, I do think that it could be possible for farmers or landowners to get money in their pockets from the state for carbon credits, right? And so this idea that if the pond is currently emitting X amount of carbon dioxide equivalences, and we can show that these management practices reduce it, and maybe it's even now a carbon sink, that could potentially be carbon crediting that could lead to farmers getting money in their pockets to change management practices for those ponds.
Ray, well, I'm just going to ask if we have any questions in this room. We'll just kind of go back and forth. Any questions from in here?
Would be a question that's not related, but
Okay.
I just wondered if she can share the slide later.
We're certainly going to try. We'll ask.
Okay.
Yeah. So that question was about whether you'll be able to share the slides.
Oh yeah, I can.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. All right, Reva. Thanks.
I think the next question is from Emily. Emily, do you want to read it out, or should I just go ahead and read it out for you?
Sure. Thank you, Meredith, for your presentation. And I had thought that I was wondering if there was any research that considers how methane emissions are reduced from agricultural sources like anaerobic digestion and flare systems that could be applied to reducing methane from ponds.
I love the question. It's not something that I've thought at all about, I have to say. I have thought about manure lagoons, because I've been working with folks from Pro Dairy at Cornell on sampling strategies for manure lagoons, because that's not usually included in methane budgets on farms, yet like dairy farms have manure lagoons, and I'm sure they're pumping out a lot of methane. But I love the idea of flares, like, but the way of potentially capturing methane, because methane's sitting in the sediments, and that's what leads to these bubbles. And we catch the bubbles in our methane, in our bubble traps. Like, people could light them on fire if they wanted to. I've always been a little too nervous to try. But if we could capture that methane and feed it somewhere, right, to be used as natural gas, that is such a cool idea. If anybody has connections to some engineer at Cornell that would want to test that out with me. Yeah, I mean, we're capturing the methane in our traps. It's not hard to capture the methane. The question would then be to how do we feed it to something that could use it?
Yeah, I think we do have one engineer that we've worked with. I don't know if this is her area, but maybe I'll reach out and see.
Yeah,
Thank you,
fun.
Meredith.
It'd be fun lunch to discuss if it's possible.
Yes. You don't have to put it yet.
We have a question from Evie, and who's, I think, joining from Kenji's link. Evie, do you want to just go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Meredith, for the great talk, and sorry about the name confusion. I hopped on Kenji's Zoom link beforehand, but I just had a question because early on you showed a slide with some publications, and one of them was on vernal pools, and I don't know, I was just trying to think, are those more on like the pond side of things or more on like the wetland side of things in terms of carbon cycling, since they do dry out? You know, could you account for hydro period somehow? I don't know, how do you consider vernal pools in terms of your work?
Such a good question. It's something that I've grappled with. It's actually some of my dissertation work was done on temporary ponds, on vernal pools. And one of the things that I kicked myself for later is that I stopped measuring fluxes as soon as the ponds dried. Like, great, field season's over, wonderful. And then a paper came out after I was done with my work that was looking at dry fluxes from aquatic habitats. So as streams dry, or as ponds dry, or as reservoir edges dry, are there fluxes of greenhouse gases coming out of those wet sediments? And the one where they found out that there was actually more greenhouse gases coming out was from ponds, from dry pond beds with wet sediments. So that was upsetting for me that I didn't look at that. But it is also a huge question if it's a wetland or inland water. And this comes down to a technicality. What's a wetland versus what's an inland water, which is like the ponds and the lakes and the reservoirs? Actually matters, because in the global carbon budgets, they're upscaled differently. There's a group of people doing wetland stuff. There's a group of people doing inland water stuff. I'm on the inland water team. The wetlands team and the inland water team sometimes get together to talk about double counting and undercounting. And there is the fear of both of those things happening. If things aren't mapped, they can be undercounted. Or if something that is being counted as a pond is actually a wetland, then maybe they could get double counted. Usually isolated water bodies are not included, but if it's like the edge of something, it could be counted as a wetland and a lake. So yes, I'm not sure where we should put those either. The wetland people are not specifically including them, and neither are the inland water people.
Let's do the slide now.
So I'm gonna make a, sorry, thanks, Evie. I'm gonna interject a little more presentation here, because I think that was a good segue about the concept of counting. If you could, maximize that to the extent you can. I think that's enough. I just wanted to show like how this work potentially intersects with some other line of work that we support here at WRI. This was basically this is a summary. I'm not expecting everybody to get up to speed on this in the next 10 seconds, but essentially what we were doing in this study is we were trying to ask, where are all of the dams in the landscape? And do we know where they are? So part of that depends on what you consider a dam. And again, if you want to know about this, we can give you the information about the paper. But the basic idea is that we have inventories of dams. They usually do a good job of getting all of the big dams. They don't necessarily do a good job, maybe for good reasons, of capturing where all of the small dams are. And a lot of times the small dam might be the kind of thing that a farmer would create in order to make a farm pond. So what you can see here basically is in red, right in the middle, you can see that based on this work, at least in a few sub-watersheds down in the Hudson Valley of New York State, that we found that there are 4 to 15 times more dams than are inventoried currently by the state of New York. And those are essentially all smaller dams. And down at the bottom, you can see a few images. I know you can't see the details very well, but of the types of places where we see dams that basically just don't really make it up to the threshold of typical state management, right? There's so much to do out there that these kind of fall under the radar, and they don't get viewed as a thing that really needs to be inventoried and tracked. And yet these are places that are creating, in many cases, small ponds throughout the landscape. We're interested in them because they can also, for example, they can be barriers to important migratory fish or other aquatic species. They usually, but not always, don't serve their intended purpose, their original purpose, which may be over 100 years old, maybe as part of an old mill or something like that. And again, this idea of these things are out across the landscape in much larger quantities than we sort of officially recognize. Sometimes they present very, very real management options for creating new or better situations in the landscape that would have potential impacts for ecosystems and in things like greenhouse gas emissions. So just the connection between this idea of small ponds and what role they play, and this idea of barriers and dams and how we manage those situations. So I just wanted to throw that out there. These are things that ordinarily 2 really different groups of people would be looking at, but through this project and Meredith's work, we've seen this connection between those 2 groups that I think will be useful, hopefully, going forward. That was it. We can send you that paper as well, if you're interested. Back to the questions.
Thanks, Brian. I see that Meredith addressed some of the questions in the chat. Thanks for doing that, Meredith. I think we have Kenji's question left on here. Kenji, do you want to just unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I guess my question was just with respect to a lot of this was a lot of the commentary was with respect to farm ponds and non-natural ponds. But I'm just wondering what that fraction of like non-natural to natural is, and if it's really largely in favor of natural ponds, does the government or like NGOs or someone have a role in methane mitigation in natural ponds, or is that something we don't want to touch?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the ratio of natural versus artificial ponds on a landscape really depends on your location. I spent a couple of years working in Minnesota, and all of the ponds seemed to be natural. And they were even using natural ponds as stormwater ponds because they just had so much, like the number of water bodies on the landscape was just so great. In Ithaca, I get here and I'm trying to find natural ponds, and all I can find are artificial ponds. A lot of ponds were even built in the 1930s by the Conservation Corps in our state forests and our state parks. So I would say in this region, a lot of our small water bodies are artificial, either just dug out or dammed, as Brian was talking about. So I don't know. And because we don't have our small water bodies mapped, I can't even give you a number for this region. But it is a really interesting question for the accounting side of things, right? Because we talk a lot about in these global carbon budgets, and even the New York State carbon budget, what is natural versus what is anthropogenic, right? And for most state regulatory agencies, they don't really care about what's happening. I mean, they care about it for accounting. They care what the natural water bodies are doing, but they're not on the hook for changing what things are. As Brian brought up with the CLPCA, we're trying to reduce relative to 1990 levels. And so the question is, okay, well, are our natural water bodies emitting the same amount that they emitted in 1990? And that's like a really tough question to answer. But we do know as we've added nutrients to our water bodies, we're getting more methane coming out. So now we've got something that's on the natural side of the budget that we shouldn't have to regulate. But we've added a human component on top of it by adding nutrients or adding sediments and erosion into the system. But then on the human built side of things, those are all in the anthropogenic budget. And so we should be on the hook for methane that's coming out of a pond that we dug out last year or 20 years ago or 100 years ago. So it is a gray area for sure, trying to figure out what we are kind of responsible for and what we just kind of want to have a number for, but it's just happening in the background. And with climate change, it'll make it even harder, right? Because things like temperature and precipitation influence carbon storage as well as greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks for the answer,
Yeah.
and great talk, by the way.
Thanks, good question. Kristen also asked what are some of the variables that we can alter in our experimental ponds. I love these ponds. They're like my dream. It's one of the reasons I wanted this job. We can manipulate water level, nutrients, plant communities, fish communities. We're adding electricity out there to some of the areas so that we could potentially do some temperature manipulations. I'd also like to try to do some of that, like if we go that route, do it with solar. We can manipulate like light penetration. There's been shading experiments done out there in the past. Yeah, I feel like, you know, if there's a way to somehow figure out how to manage it and manipulate it, we can do it.
I think that's all of the questions in the chat. Thanks for getting to all of them, Meredith. We have some time. We have like about 10 minutes left. I do want to cover a little bit about course expectations and stuff in the end. But if anyone has any last questions, now is the time to ask those.
That one of the it was Latin Town, right? That Latin Town is in Marlboro, New York.
Okay. There was a question about the ghost dam, the small dam study that we had done, and where exactly it was in New York. And again, we can make that available. Maybe we'll have a box folder. I don't know if we've already thought about this, right? But Ray, we're probably going to get the slide decks out to people. So wherever we end up doing that, we'll probably put some of the other things that we present in that folder as well.
Are there any other questions?
I guess I have kind of a short one, but if there's any way to, and this maybe has to do with barriers to connectivity and the impacts of dams, but also with respect to ponds, have you ever investigated looking at the difference between a pond's carbon budget or carbon impacts in like a streams? So if we ever wanted to, say, argue to remove a dam, whether that would be another thing we could quantify in terms of negative impacts of that pond being there.
Yes, that's a really great question. Streams tend to emit more carbon dioxide and ponds tend to emit more methane, because a lot of those streams still have a lot of oxygen running through them, but they also they run quickly, so there's more exchange. And that depends on stream order, of course, but these smaller systems, they're going to be more emitting CO2, and then they're going to get converted into a reservoir and they're going to be emitting methane. So my guess is that we would have a big carbon win for removing them and turning them back into streams, because we'd rather have some CO2 get emitted than methane.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yep. One question in here as well.
Yeah, to follow up on that question, so there's been a lot of recent publicity on the sort of recovery of beavers, sort of their effects on around Europe, they're everywhere. So I didn't know what your thoughts on that, because it kind of goes in the opposite direction of what you just mentioned about what Kenji brought up.
Yeah,
So
so
the
you
question-
said beavers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is such a fascinating question. I love beavers, and there's a great book called Eager Beaver, like the secret life of beavers and why they matter. It's such a great book. I used it in a class that I've taught in the past. There's some research being done on beaver ponds and carbon budgets. Paul Del Giorgio's lab in Montreal is working on that, especially up in northern Canada, where beavers are reestablishing themselves after 100+ years missing from the landscape. And so that is actually fascinating with 1990 levels, right? Because beaver numbers are up. And so if we're comparing to 1990, beavers might not be helping us out. Yes, so I think the general pattern is that beavers are changing the carbon cycle. They're leading to more ponded landscapes, more methane. But beavers are also being a climate win out west. I don't know if you've seen the research that shows that in western drier landscapes that are dealing with a lot of droughts and wildfires, areas where beavers have reestablished or have been purposefully dropped in, they're like parachuting beavers into places. Those areas are more resilient following a wildfire. So you can look at aerial images and you can see just burned, scorched areas near rivers, and then you can see the beaver areas that are still lush and green. So I think that's a really exciting beaver research area right now. But yes, I do think that beavers are going to lead to some more methane emissions that weren't there while they were gone, but historically would have been part of the natural budget. Great question. I love beavers.
I'll just add, and Meredith was a part of this conversation. We actually, WRI has been asked about beavers in the last year. Like, you know, we think they're causing localized flooding, but they're also providing like an ecosystem that we know is important. Should we be trying to get rid of them? How should we deal with beavers? And it ends up becoming this kind of like surprisingly complicated conversation around resilience, hydrology, you know, emergency management, depending on like, well, what's being flooded? Is it some like, you know, edge of field somewhere, or is it like the road to the hospital? So it kind of matters.
Can you all hear me? This is Kristen.
Yes. And can you guys say, if
Yeah.
you're, can you say, yeah, who you are? Like your title, I guess.
Okay, hi, this is Kristen Hitchner from Water Resources Institute. Just super quick follow-up to Kenji's question, which was, I think was a really good one. You know, if you remove a dam, and it is an interesting question to think about the carbon implications of removing a dam and reverting to stream, but sort of an obvious thing is that often dams were put where there were wetlands. So in the lower, flatter places in the topography. And so oftentimes when you remove the dams, it's actually a wetland that comes back, like there are even the old seed banks. And so it may not, that may not be, you know, there may be a stream running through it, but the system is more complex than pond to stream, I think, oftentimes. So maybe there's no questions, just a comment.
That's a good comment. We're starting, we have worked with the state that's looking at wetlands and wetland emissions. And we're seeing like extreme variability. We have some wetlands, some forested wetlands that just like aren't emitting any methane at all. And we're like, what? Why aren't they emitting methane? And then we have other ones that are huge methane emitters. So stay tuned on that. We're going to be surveying with the Natural Heritage Program that has a bunch of wetland scientists. We'll be sampling wetlands around the whole state over the next 2 years. So we should have more to say on how different wetland types are contributing to greenhouse gases and carbon sequestration as well.
Okay, I think that was all the questions. Thanks everyone for being here and being so engaged. Thanks Meredith for the great talk. We have exactly 2 minutes. I'm going to go over some of the course requirements for the students. So feel free, anybody who's not taking this for credit and needs to hop off, please feel free to hop off. But thank you so much. Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
I was saying thanks to Meredith. It was a great talk.
Thanks
Thanks for
Meredith.
having me. All right. Bye.
Thank you.